Hey there, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber, and welcome to Law&Crime Network Live. Now, as you can see, we're not in the studio. As you know, there are no live court trials. The coronavirus has completely upended a lot of our lives and our operations here on Law&Crime. But having said that, if you think for 1 second that we are not going to bring you true crime content, we're not going to bring you the latest about what's happening in these cases that we've been following, you have another thing coming, because today we are going to talk about the Robert Durst trial, which we were live in for a period of time until it ended because of the coronavirus. It's actually been suspended until May 26th. We're going to talk about the latest developments in that case, and we're also going to talk about Lori Vallow-Daybell, who's a name that's constantly been coming up in the news. She is that Idaho mother who has been charged in connection with the disappearance of her 2 children, a 7-year-old and a 17-year-old. There is a lot to break down there, and we're going to talk about it. But what we're doing here is a little bit different. If you have a question, you can ask it. Anything about these cases. If you have a theory about what happened to Joshua J.J. Vallow or Tylee Ryan, write us. We'll talk about it. If you think that Robert Durst should take the stand when the trial begins again, write us. Any questions you have, you can write us. Hey, listen, if you have a question about what am I going to do about my hair because the barbershops are closed because of coronavirus shutdown orders, write us. I may answer that question. Now, there is a lot to break down here, and I want to bring in my very special guests. First up, we got with us trial attorney Terri Austin, who's a great friend of the program and a host here as well. And, of course, executive trial producer Cathy Russon is with us. So, ladies, thank you so much for being here on Facebook and YouTube.
Thanks for having us.
Now, as you can see, there's a little bit of a delay. So just bear in mind. Now, I want to start with Robert Durst because, Cathy, with all the craziness that's been going on with the coronavirus, we haven't had an opportunity to sit down. You were in that courtroom. You were there. So I want you to break it down for our viewers. What exactly was it like to be in that courtroom, to see Robert Durst, to hear those opening statements?
Well, I tell you, it was amazing. It was definitely an experience. He is so frail and little. I'll bet he weighs 80 pounds, soaking wet. He is so tiny. And he comes in from the back room from where they have him in a holding cell, and he has to, during pretrial hearings, he used to use a walker, but he's not doing that now. So he walks in and he holds onto the bailiff's desk to get steady. And then he hangs onto that as long as he can until he can reach over and grab the defense desk and table. And he shuffles. His feet just shuffle in. He always looks around the gallery, looks at everyone, sees who's there, and then takes a seat. But he's just so small. It's really, really interesting to see him. Most of the time I sat directly behind him. I was probably maybe, 5-6 feet behind him. And he's just tiny. Also, he has a like a tablet, an iPad, something right in front of him where the stenographer transcript comes up because he's hard of hearing. So he's reading what's happening.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible to watch, considering the fact you're talking about a man who's 76 years old on trial for murder, obviously the murder of his friend Susan Berman. And Terri, I want to go to you. This delay, I don't think anybody anticipated a pandemic was going to slow this trial up, and if it will slow it up. May 26th is now the new date when we believe proceedings are going to start again. It was supposed to happen on April 6th, but it got pushed back. Does a delay like this help the defense? Does it hurt the prosecution in a way? Okay, so I think Terri, I think we're working on your audio right there. Look, there's a problem. The jurors, they've been gone for a while. What do they have to remember? What do they have to think about? So, Cathy, I'm going to go back to you. Where are we left in this trial? I mean, what was the last thing the jury heard about? Because if I seem to remember, the prosecution was continuing on with their case, and they were putting forward some pretty strong witnesses.
Yeah, so let's not forget, we had 4 days of opening statements, which was pretty phenomenal. 3 days of just the prosecutor. That was the craziest thing I had ever seen. Then the prosecution started with their case. They started with some neighbors of Susan Berman's. They saw her dogs out wandering, which was unlike that. They discovered that the dogs were out wandering with their collars and leashes still on. And then eventually somebody called it in and they did a welfare check. So some of Susan Berman's neighbors, then they called Cathy Durst's neighbor from the penthouse in New York. Now remember, the Durst had a few different residences, but in this penthouse in New York, there was a neighbor who testified about Cathy being scared of Robert Durst, of her crawling out the balcony and over to the balcony of the neighbor, coming in and saying, you know, he hit me, I'm scared of him. So they heard about that. That just brings me to how fascinating this case is, because these jurors don't have to determine anything except Susan Berman's murder, but they are hearing nonstop about Cathy Durst and Morris Black. And so it's just a convoluted story they're having to try and keep straight in their minds.
Yeah, we were watching that. We thought it was pretty surprising that the prosecution can bring up the fact about Morris Black when we all know that Robert Durst was acquitted of the murder of Mr. Black. So I don't, even if you don't really have sympathy for Robert Durst as a legal point of view, does it make sense for them to bring it up? Now, here's the question that I have for you, Cathy, because I think we're still working on Terri's audio. This cadaver note, which is something that anybody that watched The Jinx on HBO knows was a big concrete piece of evidence. And this guy, Robert Durst, said he wrote it. He wrote it. He wrote this letter directing police to the body of Susan Berman. How is the defense trying to work around that?
So we learned in a pretrial hearing in December, so just a couple months before the trial started, that all of a sudden defense is stipulating that he wrote it. And that was a huge shock, because that was the aha, got you moment for the prosecution, is this cadaver note. I think the defense knew that they kind of had Durst dead to rights on writing that, because they could compare it to a known letter he wrote to Susan Berman that he admits to writing, and it's so similar, and the misspelling of the word Beverly and Beverly Hills was exactly the same. I think that was going to be a huge moment for the prosecution. So the defense has taken that a little bit out of their cells by just admitting up front he wrote it, and so they had to admit he was there, because why else would he write a cadaver note? So their story to the jury is he came, Susan Berman told friends that he was coming to visit her around the holidays. She was excited about him coming. She wasn't scared that he was coming. She was excited that he was coming. Friends would testify about that, and that he got there that morning to take her out to breakfast and found her body there. And he freaked out because of Morris Black, because he's always been a suspect in his wife's disappearance. He knew he wouldn't be believed, and so he took off, but he wanted her body to be found because that was his friend, so he wrote the note.
Cathy, let me ask you this, because again, I think we're still working on Terri. Let me ask you this. From what you saw in the courtroom, for what you know about the case, when things start up again, this story about Robert Durst discovering the body of Susan Berman and then just hot-tailing out of there, do you feel like this is something that he's going to have to explain? Do you feel like this is something where he's going to have to testify? I mean, look at the things that are in his favor. He's a very frail, sick man. So getting on the stand, talking in that kind of weakened condition, do you think anything that you know about this guy, who's pretty open to talk about in the HBO series The Jinx, is pretty open about talking about what happened? Do you think he's going to take the stand, Cathy, from what you've seen?
Well, defense attorney Dick DeGuerin got up there in opening statements and said he will testify. Put it out there, right there. Now, we've had cases where defense attorneys have said in opening statements that the jury would hear from their client, and in the end, that didn't happen. But it's not a good idea to promise the jury something in opening statements that you don't deliver. Look, he testified in the Morris Black trial, and he was acquitted. So from his point of view, he probably thinks he can talk his way out of this. He also is very frail. He, the way he talks, one thing I wanted to mention was, because I sat so close to him, he speaks out during while court is in session, during opening statements. He turns to his attorney and has a lot to say, but he doesn't have a quiet whisper. And so you can hear that he's talking. And I tried so hard to make out his words, but his voice is high and squeaky. And I think if you've watched The Jinx, you get a little taste of how his voice is, but it's worse now. So I couldn't ever quite make out, but he's very animated at the defense table, very involved in what's being said. That tells me he wants to get on the stand and talk.
Well, I can tell you that'd be something to watch. And speaking of watching, if you're just joining us, this is a special Law and Crime Network Live. What we're doing right now is that it is a Q&A session. We're going to be taking your questions about some true crime stories that we've been focusing on here on the network. We're focusing on the Robert Durst trial. In a little bit, we're going to talk about the Lori Vallow-Daybell trial. I think we got with us Terri Austin. So again, anybody who have questions, just write us. We're going to talk about it. Terri, I have a question for you. As we're listening to this, the question of why would he do this and what was the implication behind this and him trying to kill this woman because she might have information to tie him to Kathleen Durst. Is it seem too convoluted for a jury based upon what you've seen? Is it easy enough as a motive to swallow? Because for a guy to just murder his best friend and then take off, or does that seem like something that is a story that could be believable for a jury?
I think the jury really would believe this because he seems like a cold-blooded killer. The fact that his first wife is missing, the fact that the individual who lived next door to him wound up dead. He was acquitted of Black's murder, but he still was dead. And now his best friend, Susie Berman, is dead. It seems as though everyone around Robert Durst ends up dead. So yes, I think the jury could believe that he did this.
And Terri, one more follow-up question with you. There's a question of was there a struggle or not? There's a question of whoever did this to Susan Berman, did she know her attacker or not? You've looked at some of the evidence. You've read about this case. Do you think there was a struggle? Do you think there was not a struggle? Do you think whoever killed Susan Berman, do you think she knew her attacker?
Yes, Jesse, I do think she knew her attacker. It looks as though from all of the reports that the individual was let into the apartment. She was shot in the back of the head. So I think if Durst in fact did it, he came up upon her and did it secretly. He did not want her to know this was going to happen. So I do think he knew that he was going to kill her. And I do think she was in the dark and that it was someone she knew, Robert Durst, her best friend.
All right, Terri, I want to get one more question. We actually have a question from one of our viewers right now. It's what are the possible penalties if Robert Durst is convicted? My understanding, it was life in prison, Terri. I don't know if you've seen something different. I guess the question is, why did they drop the death penalty? Because it could have been on the table, Terri.
Absolutely. Well, you know, out in California, the governor Newsom has suspended the death penalty for now. So I do think the prosecution, if they had the opportunity to pursue the death penalty, they would. But now he can either get life without parole or he could get 25 to life. And the prosecution will probably go for the maximum amount, which would be life without parole.
All right, so we're going to switch gears right now because we could talk about Durst all day, but we have a limited amount of time, and I have to get to Lori Vallow-Daybell. This is an incredible story where you have a woman, a mother, who is accused or has been charged in connection with the disappearance of her two children, 7-year-old Joshua J.J. Vallow and 17-year-old Tylee Ryan. They haven't been seen since September, and authorities believe that Miss Vallow, as well as her current husband, her fifth husband, have information about the whereabouts of these children. Now, Cathy, this is a wild story. We have heard what makes this so wild is that 3 people who are in this orbit. You have the ex-husband of Lori Vallow, who wound up dead. He was killed by Lori Vallow's brother in an act of what's claimed to be self-defense, and her brother also winds up dead under suspicious circumstances. Also, Tammy Daybell, who is Chad Daybell's former wife, she winds up dead under natural causes. My question to you, Cathy, is have we seen anything as of recent that would suggest authorities are now going to charge either Lori or her current husband, Chad, with any of these deaths?
Well, first of all, this case, if this was a movie, people would just be thinking the writers went way overboard. It's not even believable. This case is nuts. We do understand there was a leaked email just recently that shows authorities might be getting close to indicting Lori in somewhat involvement of the murder of her husband, Charles. I think it's Charles. Charles. Because like you said, Charles was shot and killed by Lori's brother in Arizona last July, and he claimed self-defense. And that case was still open when Lori then moved up to Idaho. So it wasn't that it was automatically ruled an accident, but they had always been investigating that. The brother, Alex Cox, I mean, by all accounts, he was involved in a lot of this. If you believe what authorities are believing, he was involved in a lot of this. Now we know he killed her husband, and he was seen going in and out of the storage shed up in Idaho. It seems that he had a lot of involvement, and then he ended up dead. And then with Chad's wife, Tammy, she's a healthy 40-something-year-old librarian, no health problems at all, and she just dies in her sleep. And they just rule it natural causes, and she's buried. Well, until these other deaths started coming up and the missing children, now authorities have exhumed her body, and they have not released the results of what they found from that.
I mean, yeah, it's out of a movie, and it's a movie I don't know if I even want to see. Terry, my question to you is a question that we just got from one of our viewers. Why does it take so long for parents to be detained in these kinds of cases? Because our viewer was saying that there are 2 recent cases similar to this in the news. And we know that Lori and Chad went to Hawaii. So they were in Idaho. They went to Hawaii after these kids disappeared, and she wasn't immediately arrested. So why does it take so long for her to be apprehended? Or in general, why did it take so long to parents to be apprehended in these kinds of cases?
Jesse, it depends on the jurisdiction. Some jurisdictions are going to go more quickly after the parents if they believe those parents are responsible for the disappearance of the children. Other jurisdictions, prosecutions want to wait until they have more evidence. They want to make sure if they bring the case that they can prevail at trial. My assumption here is that there wasn't enough evidence to say that these parents were responsible for the missing of these children. And in fact, they had an email, presumably from the daughter. No one else was really complaining. Apparently, the grandparents did say they were missing. But I do think that in this case, the prosecution was waiting until they had more evidence to bring against these parents who clearly somehow were involved. I think, as Cathy said, all of these missing bodies, you have to think these parents know more than they are telling.
It's unbelievable. And clearly people are angry. Clearly people want answers, and they want these kids found. Now, having said that, Cathy, we have another question. What is Lori saying, or where is Lori saying the kids are? What is her story? And I want you to think about this, Cathy, because let's not forget, Lori currently is charged with multiple crimes, and that includes solicitation of a crime, contempt, and resisting and or obstructing an officer. In other words, she ain't telling the truth. So exactly what is her story about where these kids are?
Well, she's also not speaking about that. The last time that we know of that she said anything was back when relatives were questioning, or the babysitter or neighbors, when anyone was questioning way back when in September and October, she gave different people different stories. That JJ's living with his grandparents, that he went to visit his aunt and uncle. She gave different stories. As far as we know, she's never said another word since then. But an interesting thing, Jesse, you and I were talking about before, offline, before the show started, was Chad Daybell has now come out and said the children are safe. So Chad Daybell knows where the kids are. He's not charged with anything. He knows where the kids are. Why aren't the cops charging him with something?
Great question. And you know who we have to answer that? Terry. Why is Chad Daybell not charged with anything? Yes, I know he's not so connected to it as much as Lori, but if he knows where these kids are, he recently said it, how is he not charged? How is he not brought into questioning? What's going on here? Shouldn't he be charged with something?
He should absolutely be charged at some point. Right now, he's a person of interest, but I do think at some point charges will be pending against him if, in fact, he knows something and he is not disclosing what exactly he knows to the police officers.
All right, Terry, here's a follow-up question. I'm going to hit you with 2 questions from 2 of our viewers. Keep questions coming, everybody. So the question is, first, without any bodies, so if we never discover where these children are, can she be found guilty of what she's currently facing? Now, Lori Vallow-Daybell is not charged with murder at this point. She's charged with deserting her children and ultimately lying and obstructing justice. But it should also be noted, so can she be found guilty of any of those crimes without bodies? And I'll hit you with the second question, Terri. How long can they keep Lori locked up without producing additional evidence? In other words, can they even go forward at this point? Because although she has a later date, a later hearing, a preliminary hearing, she hasn't entered a plea as of yet. So, Terri, can she ultimately face a trial, and can she ever be convicted of what she's facing if we don't get any additional information about the kids?
Absolutely, because here in Idaho, she is being held. Her bond right now is $1 million. And if she can't post it, she will be held responsible and she'll be held in jail. Now, if they proceed with trial, they could absolutely find her guilty based on the evidence that they currently have. The fact that she has non-support of these dependent children, the fact that she has abandoned these children, and she could get up to 14 years in prison. So yes, they can proceed, they can hold her, and they could possibly find her guilty, even without the bodies of the children.
It's absolutely unbelievable. We had another question that we're not unfortunately going to have time to I'll ask you guys about, but it was, do you think Chad had anything to do with the children? I'll take a stab at this one because I'm the host of the program. Why not? Yeah, I do believe he probably has some answering to do if he knows where the kids are and he's intimately involved with this. Clearly, he knows something, and clearly he has to provide answers at this point. Will he be charged a separate day? We'll wait and see. Cathy, Russon, Terri, Austin, thank you so much for coming on, and we appreciate everyone joining us here on this special edition of Law&Crime Network Live. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We'll be back. Have a great day and be safe.